Okay. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you Rob Reves and his wife Lisa this evening. They are going to give a presentation on the Civil War, and some of you have seen our display up at the museum and have been to the cemetery to see some of the Civil War graves. And our Civil War books are over there if anybody are interested in looking at that tonight. But Rob can fill in all those gaps and help us understand the importance of the Civil War in our own locale. So with that, Rob and Lisa.
It's gonna kind of be like a brame of bull. There's gonna be a point here and a point here and about a ton of bull down the middle. We're gonna talk specifically about the 11th Kansas, and we're gonna talk about the men from this area that served in the 11th Kansas, and plus the panoply of others. I'm gonna talk a little bit about collecting Civil War items, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about research as well. So the reason I'm here tonight, my great-great-grandfather was Henry Godlove. Henry Godlove came to this part of Kansas in 1859. If any of you have ever been to the Reves Cemetery, Henry and his wife are buried there. And if you will go downhill and across the creek from the Reves Cemetery to the east and on the south side, there is a stone house. And my great-great-grandfather Henry, after the Civil War, built that stone house. But when he came in '59, he bought land from Solomon Hicks. Solomon Hicks had already proved up on that claim, and I have absolutely no idea what they lived in when they bought from Solomon Hicks. But Henry Hoover was Solomon Hicks's hired man, and Henry Hoover was also a member of the 11th Kansas, and we'll talk a little bit about Henry as we go along. So, my great-great-grandfather, Henry Godlove. My dear, how tall are you?
I am 5'4".
Guess what? Henry Godlove was about 5'4", so we're going to have a little fun here, and we're going to do something to scale. So, you're going to be Private Godlove. Put your little hat on there, Private Godlove. Pick your gun up, Private Godlove. Set your gun butt down on the ground. Private Godlove.
Yes, sir.
Just hold your bayonet over the top of your gun, don't mount it. So, that gives you a little bit of scale of what Henry Godlove looked like. And I have a picture of him here in the case that you're all welcome to look at. And I'm also going to pass a picture of him around. Okay, Private Godlove, hand me the bayonet back. And if Eddie or Dale or Dennis go to sleep, pick it back up.
Yes, sir.
You can set the musket back down on the table as well. And before she takes the hat off, one of the questions I want to ask everybody is, are we still fighting the Civil War? Yeah, I see a lot of yips in the crowd, and this hat is going to tell you a little bit about still fighting the Civil War. We do some living history reenacting. We do not reenact the Civil War, we reenact the 18th century. And we have a friend who runs a rendezvous down in Pomme de Terre Reservoir in Cross Timbers, Missouri. And we go down there in the spring of the year every year to see him and be with our friends. And they usually have a little whip around charity auction, and everybody donates something, and we bid on it. And the money goes to scholarships for kids in Hickory County schools. Well, we're down there and we're at the auction several years ago, and we have a real nice young auctioneer who comes in and offers his services for free. And they held up this nice wool blue Union forage cap. And the auctioneer says, "Who will put a bid on this nice little Civil War hat?" And the crowd went deathly silent because we are in Missouri. And after a while, a voice from the crowd says, "Wrong color." And there is more silence. And then the auctioneer says, "Do I have a $5 bid on this forage cap?" And you'll never guess, ladies and gentlemen, who placed a bid on the nice little Civil War. The only bid placed. So we won the hat. I said, "Well, Cat's out of the bag, so I wore the hat the rest of the event. Not much was said to me about wearing the hat. So we still are fighting the Civil War. Another little story that I will very quickly tell you about still fighting the Civil War. We reenact at Sibley, Missouri a lot, where Fort Osage is, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to Sibley. It's just beyond Jackass Bend in the Missouri River. Lewis and Clark, before they went around Jackass Bend, Clark noted in his diary that would be an excellent place to build a fort, and so Fort Osage was built and was a trading center in the 1812 period. My grandfather was in Company K, and they burnt Sibley in 1863, in June of 1863. And sentiment is still high amongst my Missouri friends, and when we're in Sibley at an event, we do not talk about the burning of Sibley in 1863. So, give you a little bit of background on the gentlemen from this area that served in the 11th, and the majority of them were in Company K. John Bellwood was a private, and if I mispronounce a name, please correct me. Now, they have this gentleman. How is lobby spelled in this community? L-A-B-B. It's L-A-B-B. Yeah, L-A-B-B-E. This gentleman is listed as Brenner Lobby, but it's with one B. And so, I don't know if that's just a typo. Does anybody know in the ancestry, was there a Brenner Lobby? Okay. Brenner Lobby was promoted to corporal on April 1st of 1864. George W. Cockrell was discharged for disability on January 8th of 1863 in Elm Springs, Arkansas, and we'll get to why he was discharged for illness after a while. Alfred Corey was promoted to wagoner April 1st of 1863. Military wagons at the time were about the dimensions of a Conestoga, big wheels in the rear, small wheels for drivers, and the majority of them were painted blue. Flavius J. Crawford, discharged for disability, January 8th, 1863, Elm Springs, Arkansas. Ellsbury Etchison, private, and in the rolls, Etchison, the last name was shown with a G instead of a Y, so I think that's just bookkeepers there. James Garvin was a private. Adam, and it's G-I-B-A-R, is it Gibar or Jabar? Does anybody know? He was private. Henry Godlove was a private. Henry Godlove came in '59. We've talked about some of the things that Henry Godlove did, who was my ancestor. Peter Paul Grimm, and Peter Paul Grimm is buried in the Onega Cemetery, as I recall, but he has a daughter that's buried in the Rieger Cemetery. Peter Paul Grimm was promoted to sergeant September 17th of 1862, and then to second lieutenant September of 1864. The Peter Paul Grimm and now the Grimm family are in possession of the muster roll and the company history from Company K, and we are speaking with them, and hopefully we may get that donated somewhere. We're kind of excited about that. John P.P. Hegner was promoted to sergeant and then reduced in ranks, so we don't know what John did, but it must not have been very good. We spoke about Henry Hoover already. Henry was a hired man of Solomon Hicks. Henry was wounded in action October 21st of 1864. Some interesting things about Henry Hoover. He married Melinda Etchison, and Melinda actually went with them and was a company laundress, and that was not an uncommon thing for wives or sweethearts to do, to follow the men around and be laundresses or camp followers or cooks. Henry, we spoke about this at one of the cemetery tours in October, had a mineral spring on his farm that was an attraction in this area. Henry built a sorghum mill to make molasses, and it was all carved out of wood. The gears, the gudgeons, everything were wood, and they said that when Henry made molasses in the fall that you could hear the squeak of that mill running for miles around. He also built one of the first wagons in the community and made the wheels out of rounds of sycamore wood. You know, he didn't have iron and what have you didn't have the money to have rim tires, and so that's what he built his wagon tires out of. John Hoover was also a member of Company K of the 11th, and he died of disease in Lawrence, March the 13th of 1863. Everett Kellogg was discharged for disability March 18th, 1863 in Leavenworth. Somebody help me with the pronunciation here. The doctor, was it Kuntz? Kuntz. John P. Kuntz was promoted to sergeant, and there is a wonderful portrait of John in the museum, and he's in his Oddfellows regalia in the picture, and he's buried in the Onega Cemetery. John was promoted to sergeant September 19th, 1862. He was wounded in action November 28th, 1862 at Cane Hill, Arkansas. He was promoted to hospital steward October 1st of 1864, and then he was attached to headquarters as a hospital steward. I don't know enough about this, but I find that all really interesting, the fact that he was a doctor here. Did this occurrence of him being a hospital steward prompt him to be a doctor, or was he already a doctor when he joined? That's an interesting line of research. Now, some of you Coultermans in the audience, Chris Coulterman, and there are 2 Chris Coultermans listed in the adjutant's report. One is listed as Christian F, and supposedly one of them died of disease August 18th of 1864 in Oxford, Kansas. So does anybody know if there were actually 2 Christian Coultermans?
I heard there was, but I never knew there was a Christian Coulterman here. But yeah, I think he must have moved away real fast or something.
Okay, so there's a mystery solved. William Leddington was promoted to saddler March 1st of 1865, and Leddington here is spelled Ledington, and in the actual register it was Lead. So if anybody know about Leddingtons, would be interesting to know what the proper spelling is. George J. Lewis, probably the smartest one of them all, deserted in Arkansas February 3rd of 1863. John Mall was a private. Jacob Oschenbein transferred to the Veterans Reserve Corps May 21st of 1860, and we don't know, what year. I would say, since they joined in 62, that it was probably 62, that either 62 or, well, no, it would have had to have been 63. So joining the Veterans Reserve Corps tells us that he was an older gentleman, and, that's one way of getting him into a unit that was, on active duty, but not traveling here, there, and everywhere. Frederick Zimmerman was a private, and so there were 21 men from, and those men were all from Vienna Township that were in Company K. In Company L, Joseph F. Beach was a private, Simeon D. Beach was a private, and George Shore was promoted to corporal May 5th of 1864. This is a copy of an article that I wrote that Joe published in the newspaper several years ago. I've reworked it, added the information that I just read to you, and I've also refreshed my contact information in here so it's correct. So I've got, sorry I didn't know there would be so many, I've got 15 copies of this, and everybody is welcome to have this information to contact me if you have information. So, can anybody tell me when the Civil War started?
61.
What year?
1861.
You learned that in school, didn't you, Reva? Well, John Brown and his sons and some followers of his shot some gentlemen in Osawatomie for being pro-slavers in 1854 and promulgated what they call the Osawatomie War. This isn't a very good picture, but we'll say here in Kansas that the Civil War started in 1854, and so Kansas has been keeping America safe from Missouri since 1854. We'll pass that around. And here's since Lisa already played Henry Godlove, here's a picture of my great-great-grandfather Henry Godlove that we'll pass around as well. How I got interested in Henry Godlove in the 11th Kansas, something that I have not told you about Henry. When he was done with his Civil War service, like most of the men in this community, he came home, built a stone house, farmed, raised a family. He named 2 of his sons after Civil War generals, which was not an uncommon occurrence for men who had served. One of his sons was Grant, and one of his other sons was Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln was my great-grandfather. And so, from Abraham Lincoln, my grandfather, Sherman Roosevelt, God love, so it passed down another generation, and they used Sherman as a name. Of course, Sherman was a famous Civil War general. And so my grandpa Sherm told us kids from the time that we were little that Henry Godlove served in the 11th Kansas Calvary under Colonel Moonlight. He was in Company K under Captain John M. Allen, and that they fought at Pea Ridge, and that they were in Sherman's March to the Sea. And that when Grandpa left to go and join up, he went to Louisville, got on the train, went to Leavenworth, got into service with the 11th, and went on with his Civil War service. Now, that's your grandfather. You know, that's like God talking to you. That's exactly what happened. Well, the first time that I ever thought about, you know, that put a spark in me, very interested in what might have happened. So I went to the Manhattan Public Library as a teenager, and I got in the old-fashioned card catalog, and I got to thumbing, and came up with the 11th Kansas. And the first book that I came up with was from J.W. Bond, and it's called The Battle of Platte Bridge. Okay, never heard of Platte Bridge. Grandpa talked about Pea Ridge, but he never talked about Platte Bridge. And so got to leafing through this book, and this is all about a bunch of guys being up in Wyoming and fighting. And I'm like, wait a minute, Wyoming? Grandpa never said anything about that. And so I got to doing a little further research and found out that of the things that Grandpa had told us, he was right about the company, he was right about the 11th Kansas, he was right about his captain, he was right to a degree about Colonel Moonlight. The things that he was not correct on were the fact that he did not go to Louisville and get on the train, because the choo-choo tracks during the Civil War were on the Missouri side of the river, and due to the Civil War had not come into Kansas yet. So they hoofed it from here to Leavenworth to join up. And in fact, Grandpa hoofed it to Louisville. That's where he enlisted at one of the rallies. And then, you know, when they went on to join the regiment, they went to Leavenworth. The 11th Kansas started out as a volunteer infantry. They were later changed to cavalry, and even though they were changed to cavalry, the majority of the war, they didn't have enough horses, and so they walked a lot of places. So, you know, a little bit off on what Granddad had said, but it sparked an interest in me, and so I've just gone completely bonkers over the years, trying to find out everything I can about every 11th Kansas member there is. I've collected a lot of memorabilia over the years, and so I'm going to read you a little bit of a timeline of things that they did. So in 1862, you know, the war started in 61. In 1862, Lincoln called for 300,000 more volunteers. The 1860 census in Kansas shows us that that there were 10 regiments that were already formed, and so here we are. Like I said, we're talking about the 11th. Senator James Lane was appointed by the federal Commissioner of War Stanton as a commissioner for recruiting for the Department of Kansas, and he was actually competing with then Governor Robinson for control of the Republican Party, and he had previously raised 2 regiments as brigadier general and had no legal authority whatsoever to do that. Jim Lane was kind of a loose cannon. On August 4th, Lane issued a proclamation for the forming of regiments. On August 6th, Thomas Ewing Jr. was asked to recruit a regiment of infantry from Leavenworth, Jefferson, Shawnee, Wabaunsee, Pottawatomie, Riley, Davis, Morris, Lyon, Greenwood, Franklin, and Anderson counties. And in that, Ewing got first choice of the areas that he could recruit from, and so he chose those areas because they were populous. Now, as we previously said, we've already raised 10 regiments from Kansas. And so by the time you get down to the 11th, and this is borne out in the regimental history of the 11th, they talk about all the footloose and young men in the country had already been selected. So the 11th Kansas is what I like to call an old man and little boy unit. And there were young men as young as 13 or 14 in the regiment, and old men up into their 60s. Sebastian Nearing from over to Wabunsee was in his 60s, and they called him Grandpa. So, you know, there was a wide variation of ages. On August 8th, they began recruitment, and 2 companies were raised by the end of August, and the total recruitment was completed by September 14th. And they recruited up here, they recruited at America City, they recruited at Louisville, as I said, and I think they recruited at Holton as well, as I recall. An interesting side note, does anybody know where Rising Sun, Kansas is at? Well, you probably don't, because Rising Sun isn't there anymore. If any of you have ever been to Lecompton, Rising Sun was right across the river from Lecompton, and it's all fields now. Rising Sun was pro-slave. It was started by a Kentuckian who brought his slaves and timbered the area, and a lot of the wood went for the building in Lecompton. Well, even though it was pro-slave, Jerome Kunkel, who was the captain of Company D, recruited 76 men from Rising Sun to be members of the 11th Kansas. So that's just an interesting side note. Ewing, Thomas Ewing, we'll send a picture of him around, was the son of the famed Ohio Congressman Thomas Ewing Sr., who was known as the Old Salt Boiler. Ewing was an attorney, and he had a partner in his law firm before he was ever a senator. Do any of you know who this gentleman is?
I don't remember his name.
This is William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, the first picture I passed around to General Ewing, most of you probably don't have a clue as to who he is. William Tecumseh Sherman's father died when he was young. William Tecumseh Sherman was raised in the Ewing household, married a Ewing daughter, and the Ewings used their political influence to get William Tecumseh Sherman where he was in the military. All of you know who Cump Sherman is. None of you know who Ewing was, and Ewing was the more prominent one of the bunch. Thomas Ewing served as a personal secretary to Zachary Taylor. He later was very prominent in railroads. He came to Kansas to Leavenworth to work in the firm of Ewing and Sherman that had started there. These people were not prominent abolitionists. They saw which side the bread was buttered on. They fought for both pro and abolitionists, you know, as the money came in the door. But, and his father had told him, stay out of the war, son, stay out of the war, son. Well, his 2 brothers were already generals. He said, might as well get in, Dad, and so he got in. He was a member of the first Kansas Constitutional Convention, and he was the first Supreme Court Justice of Kansas, and later served as congressman from Ohio. He was run over by a horse-drawn omnibus in New York City in 1891, and that's how he passed away. The second commanding officer of Kansas after General Ewing went up to headquarters was the illustrious Colonel Moonlight that my grandfather had talked about, who became General Moonlight. He was Scottish. He was from Forfarshire in Scotland. And I know that Moonlight seems like an odd last name. One of his ancestors in the 1600s was a foundling on a doorstep in the Moonlight, and that's how they got their family name. Moonlight was with the 4th Texas U.S. Artillery from 53 to 56, so the Mexican-American War. He tried to recruit, and he worked in artillery when he was in the Mexican-American War. He tried to recruit a battery for the 4th Kansas Infantry and failed. And then he did raise the 1st Kansas battery, and then transferred over to the 11th Kansas. Later on in his career, he served as governor of Wyoming Territory, and before that, when he was in Wyoming, he was very fond of the drink, made the misfortune of hanging a couple of Blackfoot chiefs, and they were out on a scout and the Indians ran away with their horses, and so they had to walk back. So pretty big disgrace, but he still ended up serving as governor of Wyoming. The third commanding and last commanding officer, the 11th, was Preston Plum, and I was talking to ladies at supper about this. They said, "Oh, that's how Plum Hall in Emporia got its name." Well, Preston Plum did a sight more than just having Plum Hall at Emporia, Kansas, named after him. Plum was a rabid abolitionist, came to Kansas in the 1850s, brought a cannon, brought rifles, brought men, came through Missouri to do it. He was an Ohio boy, and he was a member of the first Congressional Congress here in Kansas. He was court reporter for the Supreme Court, very good friends with Ewing. He was the founder of the town site of Emporia. He was an attorney. He was our state representative in '72, and also had he had a paper in Xenia, Ohio, but he had the Kansas News here in Kansas, and he was a state senator from Kansas from '77 to '91. I have a number of items that belong to Plum up here. These are the shoulder bars off of his uniform and possibly 2 buttons off of his uniform. The GAR chapter in Emporia is named after him. There's a ribbon from the GAR chapter, and one of the state conventions that was held in Emporia, I have 3 medallions that bear his portrait. I have a very dear friend, Joanna Wickman of Wickman Historical in Casper, Wyoming, excuse me, who is writing an exhaustive biography of Plum at the moment. If any of you are interested, please get on the internet and search her out. And she would kill me for telling this story, but Plum was also known for being a rampant ladies' man. When he died in '91, and he died of apoplexy, which was a stroke, he had been told by his physician to quit Washington and go home, but he died in Washington, D.C. They brought his body back. He's buried in the Maplewood Cemetery in Emporia, and his wife had a boulder, a granite boulder imported from Colorado at a place that they were very fond of, that they vacationed at, and placed over his grave. And the fun local story in Emporia is they brought the boulder in on the train, great undertaking to get it off the flat car onto a wagon, teams, pull it out of the cemetery, great undertaking to lay it on the grave. Once it was laid on the grave, Mrs. Plum said, "There, that'll keep the SOB down." Another prominent officer of the 11th Kansas, and he was captain of Company E, was Edmund G. Ross. You may remember that after the war, and this is one of, I talked about Jim Lane being a wild card earlier. This is one of the greatest things that Jim Lane ever did for Kansas. Jim Lane shot himself, and Edmund G. Ross took over his Senate seat. Edmund Ross cast the deciding vote that kept President Andrew Johnson from being impeached. And so that was political suicide for him, killed him on a national front, but Edmund Ross did go on to be the governor of New Mexico Territory. And he was also a printer in Topeka, and I'm going to tell a little story about he and some of his guys later on concerning being a printer. Grenville Gove Grenville Gove is a name that you're probably not familiar with. I have a JR ribbon from the Manhattan Post here, which was named Lou Gove Post. He was first lieutenant of Company G in May of '64. On October 7th of '64, he died of brain fever in Olathe. You don't think you've ever heard of Lou Gove, but you have, because Gove County, Kansas is named after Lou Gove. And also, as I said, the JR chapter in Manhattan was named after Lou Gove. He was a Welshman. Joel Huntoon. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Huntoon name. If you've ever been to Topeka and been on Huntoon Boulevard, which is not named after Joel, but named after another family member, a very prominent family in Topeka. Joel Huntoon was captain of Company H, and he was an extremely brave gentlemen. Coming to my own grandfather's company, Company K, John M. Allen was the captain. I get to see, I'm a Mason, and every time I get to go to Manhattan Lodge, they have a picture of John M. Allen hanging on the wall down there. After the war, he was prominent not only in Masonics, but also in the anti-temperance movement. Josiah Hubbard was second lieutenant in Company K. Josiah Hubbard was one of the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony abolitionists from Rhode Island. Josiah Hubbard had had enough of Kansas after the war, and he was a school teacher and went back to Rhode Island and spent his life there and is buried there. If any of you ever watched History Detectives on Channel 11, and more especially the Cowan that has the Cowan auction service, within the last 15 years, Cowan found in the Hubbard family Josiah Hubbard's saddle, his pistol holders that went on the saddle, 3 albums of photographs, and the jacket that he is wearing in that picture, and they are up for auction and floating around the country. And if I ever get the chance, I'll trade my wife and 2 boys for some of those. So there's just a very brief sketch of some of the officers that were and men that were in Company K. Half of the original officers had seen previous service in the 2nd Kansas, which was a 90-day regiment, which was formed in 1861, and nearly all the officers except Moonlight and the surgeons went around and did the recruitment in the various communities. When they actually got to Fort Leavenworth, and everywhere that a Civil War unit lit, they established a camp, and so they established Camp Lyon at Fort Leavenworth, and they were awaiting Enfield rifles, and they were also awaiting a military bounty, and I think at that time the military bounty for signing up was $20, which would be several hundred in today's money. Federal government was not forthcoming with funds. Ewing, having been an attorney in Leavenworth, made a deal with some of the local merchants and banks and was able to give the men their signing bonuses, and they were waiting for Enfield rifles. Instead, they were issued this big honking rifle that Private Godlove was holding earlier. This is a Potsdam musket. These were actually originally built for Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars, and the same design went up. The last of these rifles was made in 1839 in Prussia. They are 72 caliber. So there's the hole. And another thing that is hotly debated amongst Civil War scholars is, and this is smoothbore, it is not rifled, so you shot an undersized ball out of this, but they shot a buck and ball round. So it was 1 ball and 3 buckshot on the top of it, tied up in a paper cartridge, and then the powder in the paper underneath. You would, when they talk about fitness of soldiers, when you went into the service, you know, some of you gentlemen that served, they didn't look at flat feet or look how curved your back is. They said, show us your teeth, boy. They want you to have enough teeth to be able to reach into your cartridge pouch, pull the tail end off of that paper cartridge, dump the powder in, then shove her in and ram her home. So you had to have good teeth to be fit for service. These rifles weighed over 10 pounds, and they shot a 72 caliber, you know, an undersized, under 72 caliber ball and 3 buckshot. Heavy, heavy, heavy. The Enfields that they were waiting on to receive were almost identical to the Springfields that were being made in U.S. armies, U.S. armories. The Enfields were made in Great Britain. They were 58 caliber and over a pound lighter than these rifles were. But this is all they had, so this is what they were issued. The United States government bought 163,000 of these rifles from Prussia, and the Confederates bought 53,000. The Union bought them not only to have something to put in the hands of their soldiers so they could get other rifles bought or manufactured, but they bought those 163,000 to keep them out of the hands of the Confederates. But the Confederates still got 53,000 of them. So on October 4th, they headed for Fort Scott, and Ira Hodson, when I talk about old men and little boy units, When Ira Hodson was 13 years old, he walked from Wabunsee to Leavenworth and said, "I want to sign up." And they said, "Nah, you're a little boy, go home." Ira Hodson did not go home. He signed on with a freighter, walked twice up and down the Santa Fe Trail. Came back when he was 14 years old to Leavenworth, said, "I want to sign up." Here we are, we're out of men. They said, "Okay, kid, we'll take you on." So we're headed to Fort Scott. All these older men carrying these big, heavy clubs, and here's little Ira Hodson packing his rifle. Little Ira Hodson, who had just twice walked down the Santa Fe Trail, and the old man said, "Ho, ho, boy, you're going to be up in the wagon and you're going to be crying for mama." Well, they got down the road a piece, and the old men were in the wagon, and Ira Hodson was walking, and he was laughing. Ira Hodson, when he got down to Prairie Grove, Arkansas, he saw what he described as a very ugly man with a huge nose begging a pan off of a local woman to fry some side meat in. And he approached this gentleman and came to find out that it was his father's brother who he had never met before. So a little side note on Ira Hodson. On October 19th, they reached Pea Ridge. But this is actually after the Battle of Pea Ridge that we all think of as Pea Ridge, and they were greeted by General Schofield. Another little aside that I don't think that I have told yet. Grandpa said that Henry was on Sherman's March to the Sea. He was not. My darling wife loves this because her great-great-grandfather, who was in the 147th Illinois Infantry, actually was on Sherman's March to the Sea. We have discovered that. The first time that the 11th saw action, or were going to see action, was at Old Fort Wayne, which is down in Oklahoma, and they would have been up against General Cooper, and here's a picture of General Cooper and his Confederate Cherokees, and they did not get there in time for the battle, but they got there in time to be given 250 prisoners to take care of. Company A of the 11th was set to foraging for whatever they could get for provisions, and there was a mill at Cowskin Creek, and there were millers amongst the men of the 11th, and so the grain that was there they absconded with and milled flour. On November 7th, in that area, they burnt a tannery, and 2 men of the 11th were lost to gunshots from bushwhackers. On the 27th of November, they loaded up the wagons, put on their greatcoats, put 3 days of rations in their traveling kits, and they headed towards Cane Hill, Arkansas at 11 a.m. in the morning at the Double Quick, which essentially was at a run. And they joined battle with Reves Battery in the 2nd Kansas Calvary, and it was a 40-mile march. And then once they got there, they had a 12-mile running fight with troops under Confederate General Hindman. On the 29th, they went back to Cane Hill, Arkansas to rest up and get resupplied. While they were there, we saw Edmund Ross's picture earlier. Edmund Ross and a number of men of Company E were printers in Topeka. There was a printing press, and there was typeface that had been taken back on a debt from the Cherokee Nation and was in a shop in Cane Hill. When the Confederates had gone through there, they had broken parts on the press and all that little type in trays, which they looted part of it for lead to melt down for musket balls. The rest of it they dumped in piles out in the street. These guys from Company E of the 11th Kansas sorted enough type that they printed a company newspaper, and this is one of the ways that we know that they shot a buck and ball load. The masthead of their paper was the buck and ball. They had sheets of Army foolscap, which would have been legal size ledger paper, and the type is all odd, but they sorted it out. They wrote up everything that they had done from the time that they had got into Camp Lyons up to the present and printed it. And they didn't have one big B for the masthead, and so they had to carve it out of wood. And if you ever find an original buck and ball newspaper, you'll know it's an original because the 1B looks hinky. They asked what the motto for the paper should be, and one of the more senior of the members said, since they were shooting this rifle, said that the motto should be 72 caliber gives the rebels HE double hockey sticks. They thought that was a little too bold, and so the actual motto on the paper is, the Kansas boys are poison to the hull. So they have printed this sheet, you know, this little company newspaper, which was unheard of during the Civil War. Can anybody tell me what happened on December 7th? It's a day that lives in infamy, isn't it? Pearl Harbor? Yeah. Something else happened on December 7th. The Battle of Prairie Grove happened on December 7th. And the 11th, again, at the Double Quick, which is essentially running, headed from Cane Hill to Prairie Grove to join in the fight. The men ran so fast, and it was winter time, and they had these wool greatcoats on. A lot of them threw their coats off as they went to get into the fight. And so they were joined at Reves Mill. This battle happened over 2,500 acres. About 600 of it is still preserved. In even years, they recreate the Battle of Prairie Grove, and we've been 3 times now. And so the place that you go is actually the culmination of the battle. It's beautiful. If any of you are ever interested, it's the first weekend in December. So we will be going again for the reenactment this year. So they came to Reves Mills at the Double Quick. They were joined by the 1st Kansas Indian Regiment, 2nd Kansas Dismounted, the 13th, the 2nd, which was a dismounted unit, the 10th, the 3rd Indians, Hopkins and Reves batteries, which were the cannoneers. The Confederates were on the high ground around the Borden House, and they were under Hindman and Marmaduke, and Blunt and Herron were the 2 commanders for the Union, and I have a picture of Blunt that you can send around. Fought all that day, fought up and down the hill. When night came on, most of these men were exhausted and they were freezing because they dropped their coats on the way to the battle. Lost my place here. Oh, Henry Palmer, who was lieutenant in the 11th Kansas, found a tent that was set up on a hillside, crawled into it to get warm. There was a bunch of men in the tent. When Palmer woke up the next morning, he figured out that the tent had been erected to collect the dead, and so he'd slept amongst dead men that had been collected all night long. Amongst the men of the 11th that were killed or wounded at the Battle of Prairie Grove was John C. Rooks, who was a private of Company I from Burlingame. He was shot in the lungs. He did not die till the 11th. He was taken to Fayetteville. Rooks County, Kansas is named after John Rooks. On December 8th, General Hindman, the Confederate general, under a flag of truce, asked for a 2-hour delay to retreat. This was in the dark. Hindman had his men up around the Borden House and on this big hillside like fires all over. They muffled their horses' hooves and they ran off in the night. And so that was his inglorious retreat. Before the battle, Hindman had bragged in a local paper that the Union men that were attacking them were nothing more than pin Indians, which were Indians who had joined the Union cause and were given a pin because of it. Free Negroes, Southern Tories, Kansas Jayhawkers, and Dutch cutthroats. But those men showed him what was what. So we talked about the buck and ball earlier. They had loaded up those half-printed sheets of the buck and ball in an ambulance. Maybe Dr. John was the one that did that. They went along with him to the battle. They came back to Cane Hill, brought the ambulance back. All the people at Cane Hill, you know, most of the Arkansas people were Confederates, and they were very dispirited seeing the Union guys come back victorious. And so Thomas Ewing told the regimental band to strike up Dixie, and so they struck up Dixie, and all the Confederates cheered. So the men of Company E who had printed the first half of the paper got together, flipped her over. Everything they did in the Prairie Grove is on the back side, and they printed those sheets. So the Buck and Ball is a 2-sided newspaper. Blunt ordered a mounted defensive, but there were massive storms that came after the Battle of Prairie Grove. On December 27th, on a march up Cove Creek Road towards Van Buren, the Confederates had cut all the bridges behind them. So here these men are in winter conditions and raining and snowing. They forded creeks and streams 36 times on the way to Van Buren. So just soaked to the skin. At Van Buren, they led an attack on 4 steamboats. They captured 4,300 pounds of corn, molasses, and sugar. They scuttled the horse-drawn ferry there, and they had Hindman's men were still getting across the river, and so they shelled back at them, but the shelling was very limited. They also captured 60 wagons with teams and 250 head of cattle, horses, and mules. On the 31st of December, they headed north to winter camp at Reves Mills, were resupplied from Fort Scott by a train led by some soldiers that were at Fort Scott. Schofield resumes command, and Blunt went to Elm Springs, and then finally on to a winter camp in Springfield, Ohio. On January 20th, companies C, E, H, and K, my grandpa's company, took wagon trains through mud to the swollen White River and built a ferry chain to go across the river. They went into winter camp at Crane Creek, which was 30 miles south of Springfield, and the conditions were so terrible there in the wintertime, men dying left and right of colds, of influenza, of diphtheria, cholera. They described that area as the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And the men that we talked about earlier that were discharged for disease, that's where a lot of them were discharged. On March 17th, they were told that the Confederates were massing at Forsyth, Missouri. Went there, it was a false alarm. On March 27th, they marched to Fort Scott. They were allowed a 30-day furlough. So here we walked all the way to Arkansas. We walked back to Fort Scott. They said, hey men, go home for 30 days. And so they scattered and went home. Little Ira Hodson, 14, 15 years old, from Wabaunsee, went back. Bloody Bill Anderson and his family lived at Wabaunsee. Ira Hodson went back to chase Bloody Bill Anderson while he was on furlough. Late in April at Fort Scott, Moonlight made Plum lieutenant colonel. General Ewing assumed command of the 1st Division of the Army of the Frontier, marched to Salem, Missouri. The divisions were split, and part of them went southeast to fight Marmaduke. Okay. On June 5th, they came to Rolla, Missouri, went by rail to Washington, Missouri, took the steamboat Fanny Ogden, and I talked about, you know, in the military van they had those wagons. They took those wagons apart, and I don't mean they just, you know, took parts off of them. They took the box off, they took the running gears apart, loaded them on the Fanny Ogden, and they went through Jeff City, Boonville, and Glasgow, where they docked on the 7th, and then docked on the 17th in Lexington. There were so many contrabands, slaves who had sought their freedom, that when they took the boat out from that post, they were literally having to use the fixed bayonets and poke at people to get the contrabands from getting on the boat with them. On June 22nd, H&K burned Sibley, Missouri, which we already talked about. On July 11th, Schofield ordered them to become a cavalry, so they went from being an infantry being a cavalry. They were issued Enfield rifles, which we talked about earlier, which were 58 caliber, lighter, but you can imagine mounted men with, you know, almost this long a rifle on horseback. That's all they had, that's what they dealt with. They, at this time, they were scattered from where Kansas City is today, clear down to Baxter Springs. They were helping repel the guerrillas out of Missouri and also the actual Confederate units out of Missouri. On June 26th, where the Sprint Center in Kansas City is now, there was a military prison that was in a 3-story building, and the top floor of that building was used as a artist loft by the noted painter George Caleb Bingham. and it would have been at 1409 Grand Avenue in McKee's Addition. On the first floor, there was a Jewish man who ran a stationer's shop and a tobacco shop. And they had in the top floor of this military prison, most of the people that were in this military prison were women. And Cole Younger had sisters there, Bill Anderson had sisters there. I have a picture of Frank Parker in this box. Frank Parker was captain of the guard, and he was from Company I the first week of August. He noticed that the walls were starting to crack on the building. He went to the provost marshal and said, hey, I think the building's going to fall down. It took quite a bit of time for them to decide that maybe it was. By the time they got back to inspect, they were going up an outside staircase and the building collapsed. And they were able to rush back down the stairs. There were 4 women killed. And Bloody Bill Anderson's sister was one of them. And this was the start of the Youngers and the Jameses and that whole bunch from Missouri starting their depredations. And Bloody Bill Anderson, that's why. So we played a ignominious part in that. Preceding this, we would go to Lawrence and the sacking of Lawrence, which was actually the second sacking of Lawrence with Quantrill. Colonel Plum was stationed outside of Lawrence. By the time it happened, he rushed to the scene, but he was too late to get there. As we know, most of the men in Lawrence were killed. The gentleman that they were actually targeting, you got a question, Rosie?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Yes.
I just read last night that Lawrence had turned in all their guns because the government promised to protect them.
Yep.
Lesson.
Yep.
Big lesson.
Yeah.
Don't give up your guns.
And you know why they went to Lawrence?
They went to Lawrence because they were angry about those women dying, I thought.
That's part of it. They went to Lawrence to kill Jim Lane. And Jim Lane was there. Jim Lane was in bed. Jim Lane went out the window in his long-handled underwear and hid in the cornfield while the men and some of the boys of Lawrence were killed. So, like I said, the greatest thing that Jim Lane ever did for Kansas was kill himself. After that, they chased Shelby and the guerrillas, like I said, from Kansas City down to Baxter Springs. They learned a lot from those guys. Military sidearms holsters at the time had a flap and a snap. You see, I don't think that I've got any pictures of any of these guys doing it. You were usually issued one pistol if you were issued a pistol or you bought your own. You see pictures of these guys from the 11th. They've got 2 or 3 pistols on, and they have either cut the flap off of their pistol holsters or they have them tucked inside so they had quick access to their pistols. So in 33 days during this time period, they were in the saddle 700 miles, 33 days, and that takes us up to September 29th. Still seeing action, you know, against the guerrillas on in December of '63. Plum with companies CF and K went to Humboldt, Kansas, and also with M and the 3rd Wisconsin and 2 Mountain Howitzers to repress people there. And then in 1864, since they had finally become Calvary, they got to turn in, the majority of them got to turn in their Enfields. I have still seen pictures of men with Enfields that are dated latter in the year, but they received arms that would be appropriate to cavalrymen, which would have been Gallagher's, Sharps, Smith, and Star carbines. My great-great-grandfather's picture shows him with a 59 slant breed Sharps. Don't know if that was a prop from the photography studio in or if it was what he actually carried. And at this point, folks, I have kept you for over an hour, and if you would be so kind at some future period, I had told you earlier about the first book I ever read was about the Battle of Platte Bridge up in Wyoming. If you would be so kind at some point and ask me back, I will give a future presentation which tells what they did in 64 and 65. So with that, I'm briefly going to talk about a couple of other things and quit. You'll notice on my person a badge. My mother stood up earlier and talked about the DAR. I am a member of the Sons of Union Veterans. This is our national magazine, the Banner. To be a full member, you have to prove that you had an ancestor that served in the Civil War. You can be an auxiliary member through just having interest. There is another men's organization that carries on, and what this is an outgrowth of, after the Civil War, Union men formed what they called the GAR, which is the Grand Army of the Republic, which is tantamount to our VFW and American Legions today. As these men aged, and you did have a GAR chapter here in Onega. It was Post 39, and it was named Custard Post, and it was named after Amos Custard, who was killed up in Wyoming, and we'll talk about that at a later date. But you also had a Sons of Union Veterans chapter, and in your Blue Onega history book, you've got a picture of the hall with the Sons of Union Veterans set up. So as the men aged and died, the Sons came on as an auxiliary organization. There are also 3 organizations for women. The WRC, which is the Women's Relief Corps. You know, this organization was formed up when the actual veterans were still alive. These ladies are still going. There is also the LGAR, which is the ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic. They're still going. And the third organization for women is called Daughters of Union Veterans. So if any of you gentlemen or ladies have interest in any of those organizations, we'd love to have you. Very briefly, and this isn't even a quarter of what I've got. This is a master's thesis that was written on the 11th. Recently, a gentleman from California published Blue Coat and Pioneer. His name is John Hart, and his ancestor who fought in the 11th Kansas was John Hart. John and his twin brother Hugh actually fought in the 11th. Hart's Basin in Colorado is named after John's ancestor. This is a copy of troop movements from the federal government. This is kind of a Bible to know where they went and what they did. And last but not least, and he was an attorney in Wichita, and he now is a professor at Emporia State. But this is called At War on the Prairie, the Campaigns of the 11th Kansas by Kevin Johnson. Super nice gentleman. And he originally published this as a thesis. He was kind enough to give me a galley copy of it. And so I can have copies of this made. So if anybody would be interested, I would be more than willing to give you a copy of this. Please come up and look at my cases. And the last thing that I'm going to say before I quit, this is my latest fun baby. My poor, long-suffering wife. We drove to Chicago to buy this bayonet.
It was a long drive.
This was my Valentine's Day present this year. This is a struck medal of Edmund G. Ross, who we talked about. But my latest research venture, this canteen is a model 1858 straight side. I was successful in winning it and this picture in an auction. This is supposedly James Schrader of Ozaki, who was in Company D, and we'll get into this if you allow me to come back and give another talk, but Schrader was instrumental after the battle at Platte Bridge. So this supposedly is his canteen. This supposedly is a tintype of him. We have run this through facial recognition software. We can get his hair, his ears, his eyes, and his nose to match up to measurements, but the length of because we've got some other known pictures of him as an old man, but we cannot get the length of face to match up. So if anybody knows any Schraders from down to Ozaki, Kansas, I'd sure like to meet him to see if we can find out if this is actually him. So with that, thank you for listening to me prattle for over an hour. Again, come up and look at the displays. Does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Yes.
Okay, you talked about a cemetery. Tell me where it's at, and where's the God Love Road? I know that place.
Havensville Road.
Havensville Road.
Yep.
It's
Rager Cemetery's up on the hill.
okay. How about God Love Road? Named after?
Yes. Name for my family. So, yeah.
That was my question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You mentioned that. Is it Platte Ridge or Platte Bridge?
Platte Bridge.
So why were they fighting in Wyoming so early?
They didn't. That was to the end, Rosie. That was That was 64, 65
Oh,
when
okay,
they were
okay,
up there. And you and I have sat down and talked about that, but if you're nice enough to let me come back sometime, we'll explore that
I
story
hope
further.
so.
You mentioned that it was the old man and the little boy.
Yes,
Well, going back to this Chris Colderman,
Yes.
Jolene Teskey Cervantes has done a lot of Civil War research for us, and she ran across these two, Chris and Chris, and it looked like, from what she found, one was the dad and one was the son.
oh,
And so when you said that, that makes me think that it was father and son then that joined at that time.
and that was not an uncommon thing to happen either. Ira Hodson's father joined, but he was not with the 11th, he was with a different unit. But there were a lot of instances where fathers and sons. One other place name, Fox Wynn was an officer in Company D, later with the railroads. Winnie, Texas is named after Fox Wynn, so. Yeah.
It's the first time I've heard Bloody Bill Anderson and Wabansie County mentioned together, so what was that?
The Anderson family lived at Agnes City, which is now defunct in Wabansie County. You'll have to read up on it. You know, it's more than I'd want to even try to get into tonight.
I mean, he was from Kentucky.
But the family, you know, as pro-slavers, moved out here to forward the pro-slavery cause in Kansas. They were accused of a lot of horse thievery down there, and he also had a dalliance with a local judge's daughter, and a gentleman was shot. So, yep.
I've never heard that
Yep.
before.
It's a fact. You know, we always think of all the pro-slavery stuff being east, and even in eastern Kansas. Randolph, Kansas. Gardner Randolph was an owner of slaves from Kentucky who came here. You know, was trying to foster the slavery agenda. An abolitionist moved in. They were sent to a military court, I think at Fort Riley. They said the first man that gets back and starts to build a cabin in the town site decides whether the town is pro or abolitionist. The abolitionist guy beat Gardner Randolph back, so the town still bears his name, but slavery is how Randolph was established. 1863, Salina, Kansas. Bunch of pro-slavery men rode through there, busted up the town, sold a lot of arms from a gun dealer out there. I have seen accounts from Centralia that there were night riders at Centralia, so it was happening here. You know, we don't think of it happening here, it was happening here.
Battle of the Spurs, just north of Holton too.
There's a whole lot happening, we don't know.
Yeah, why was that sign taken down?
Why was what sign taken?
That John
Track of it.
Brown sign out there north of Holton on 75. I noticed it's gone.
That I don't know. That I don't know.
Cancel culture, that's why.
Cancel culture.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.